Hello, and welcome to Discussing Dance Data, where we will explore the impact of the pandemic on the financial structures of nonprofit dance organizations. My name is Crystal Collins. I use they and she pronouns, and I am the Leadership and Learning Specialist at Dance USA. I am a 20-something brown-skinned, non-binary Black American wearing a pink turtleneck sweater. In just a few minutes, you'll hear from Dance USA's Director of Research, Sarah Morrison, and SMU DataArts' Director, Zannie Voss. They will share findings from 2 different datasets exploring the impact of the pandemic on nonprofit dance organizations. They will examine data from before, during, and after the pandemic. Thank you to Interpreter Now for providing ASL interpretation. To adjust your closed captioning, navigate to the meeting controls toolbar and click the Show Captions icon. There will be time to ask questions and engage in the findings. So when a question arises, we encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A function. During the Q&A portion, you can also use the raise your hand function to say your question out loud. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available for playback. Immediately following the webinar, we'll ask you to fill out a very short feedback survey. This will ensure that your ideas of the dance ecosystem is accurately represented in Dance USA's programming and events. Thank you in advance for your feedback. Now, I present to you Dance USA Director of Research, Sarah Morrison.
Thank you, Crystal, and welcome everyone. It's a delight to be here to share this very large data set that I've been swimming in for the last couple of months. I'm really happy to have Zannie here as well from SMU DataArts. They've been doing this work for many, many years, and to see some sort of breakouts from the dance ecosystem in conjunction with our analyses from a separate data set is really exciting. So we can sort of see where there's some overlaps. And also, while Dance USA is going to be presenting a sort of large swath overview from 990 data, Zannie will be able to get into a little bit more of the details from their surveys that they conduct. So I suppose I should introduce myself first. I'm Sarah Morrison, and I am the Director of Research at Dance USA. I have light skin, long brown hair. I go with she, her pronouns. I'm zooming in from the land of the Erie people, Cleveland, Ohio. I have a beautiful photo of Lake Erie behind me. I took this photo in an area down the street from where I live on my commute sometimes to some rehearsals after work. And I could see a beautiful sunset there. I would love to actually now share, go ahead and Crystal, if you could bring up the first slide. So you see research at danceusa.org, that email is there. I really do believe in communicating. I know data can sometimes be very exciting and methodological for the people who deal with it every day. And then for people who don't deal with it every day, it can kind of seem like a lot of information and a lot of things to go through in terms of the methods and the context. So I really encourage anyone who has questions on methodology, on what we were looking at, why we were looking at it, how it might apply to you. Please, if we don't get to your questions today, please email me. I would love to talk about this further with anyone who's interested. I will be out of town for a couple of weeks after this, so it might take me a little bit to get back with you, but I'm always very excited about other people who are excited and curious about data. So always feel free to reach out via email. With that said, I'm going to give a lot of context. For some of you, this may be very interesting. For others, it may be a little bit glossy, but hopefully it will sort of stay in the middle. So Dance USA collected data from 990s. So those are the government forms that nonprofit organizations are required to file to the IRS. And And there are three types of forms. There's the 990 postcard, the 990 EZ, and the full 990. Before we begin, I would like to sort of explain how we pulled our sample from this overall sample from nonprofit data. So on the slide here, it says where the data comes from for this analysis. You see a table, you have 3 columns in the top, and you have 6 rows on the side. The columns on the top read all nonprofits in the US, all nonprofit dance organizations in the US, and nonprofit dance organizations sampled for the main analysis. In the left hand, in the rows, you see sort of a list of different budget sizes. These budget sizes were picked because Candid, and also formerly known as GuideStar, created a report that is listed key facts on US nonprofits from 2021 that actually listed the percentage of nonprofits in these different budgetary categories. So the reason we've chosen these categories for this particular table is because we want to replicate so we can see how our data compares with the full nonprofit dance ecosystem. And then the nonprofit dance ecosystem, which we would call in this case, our population or our universe. So in the left-hand column, all profits in the US, we see about 76% in the budgetary range between $0 and $100,000 annually. We see about 13% in the budgetary range between $100,000 and $500,000 annually. About 3% between $500,000 and $1 million. About 5% between $1 million and $5 million. And about 3% who make over $5 million on an annual basis, or who spend over $5 million. Typically, budgets are based on expenses, but you should always check when you're looking at the data. So all nonprofit dance organizations in the United States would be the second column. We see, so the total number of nonprofits that are not dance organizations, all nonprofits, is 1,304,980. The total dance nonprofit organizations as designated by NTEE codes, so those are government codes assigned to dance A62 or ballet A63, is 4,762, of which about 77% are between 0 and 100,000, 15% between 100 and 500,000, 3% between 500,000 and $1 million, 3% between $1 million and $5 million, and about 1% over $5 million. So not too different from the full nonprofit population, with a little less on the higher side. I'm going to go ahead and share what our sample looks like, because it's important when you look at data to know that the sample may not be a perfect random sample. In other words, we're not just picking people randomly and getting a really nice representation, but we might be getting a little bit of a smushed representation. Our sample is very large, however, so we're hoping that it does represent the population in general. Because we can't use postcard data, 990Ns are organizations who make less than $50,000 annually are not required to file informational numbers. So because there are no numbers, we can't use them in any kind of analyses. So even though we recognize that 50% of the United States nonprofit dance ecosystem is within that group, they are not included in this particular analysis because we can't access that data. With that said, we do have a pretty large population under 100,000, which is about 35%. Because people who make under $50,000, a lot of them still file because it benefits them in some cases for grant writing and also practice. We have about 39% between 100 and 500,000, about 11% between 500,000 and $1 million, about 11% between $1 million and $5 million, and about 5% in the $5 million plus. And you can look at the numbers as well there. So we have, most of our sample is in the smaller budgetary range, representing sort of the larger ecosystem as a whole. The reason this is important is for several reasons. One, our sample size is very large, so it's more likely to represent the entire population. The second thing is that because the distribution is rather similar to the distribution of the ecosystem of the population or universe, it is more likely to represent that information. So next slide, please. A couple of other things just to be aware of. I did mention that the organizations who filed the 990 or 990 EZ are included. We can only include the folks who filed 5 years consecutively. So in order to make an apples to apples comparison, as they like to say, we wanted to make sure that the folks that we compared were the same exact people from year to year. One of the challenges with dance data is that sometimes people will make comparisons when different people are in the sample. So that also narrowed down our sample size. We narrowed down based on the NTE codes, and then we did not include the 990N filers for the reasons I already suggested. And then we did make sure that we only included, so 2018 is kind of our baseline. That's what we're looking at, is like, this is the baseline we're going to compare to. If they didn't spend at least $1 in 2018, we did not include them because the assumption was that they weren't kind of really active. And even if it was a low amount, we considered them active because there is so much variability in the field of dance between the accordion budget, which we like to say, which is like 1 year they might spend and make a lot, the next year they might kind of reduce, and even on the smaller end, it can be quite substantial. So we also, in order to try to get a sample that's a little bit more performance oriented, because these do include all nonprofits who are self-assigned dance or ballet, we excluded folks who had the following modifiers in their name: booster, club, friend, guild, parent, teacher, team. And we can go ahead to the next slide. So on the right, you see a map. It's a heat map with sort of pretty lavender colors. And the darker areas, we actually see representation from all of the states, except for Wyoming. But even the states where it's hard to see, South Dakota and Iowa, we have some folks from there. But the reason I'm sharing this is to kind of share that the geography is very, it does kind of represent the geography of our distribution of dance organizations. We see the sort of hotter spots in California and New York, and then we see a lot of different activity going on throughout the rest of the country at various levels. We have a breakout of 486 organizations who identify as dance organizations, that's A62. And we have 220 organizations that identify themselves as ballet organizations. I will mention that this is not as clean as it looks when you look at this kind of organization. A lot of people identify in different ways that can cover different ranges, so keeping that in mind. As of 2018, wow, that would be a lot of data to look at. As of 2018, the years of operations ranged from 1 to 65 years. So we had organizations who had only been in existence for a year, and others for 65 years. And the median was about 22. So half the organizations were less than 22 years old. Half the organizations were more than 22 years old. The budgets range from $144, that's in expenses, from 2018 to $89 million. As you can see, it's a very large range. The dance ecosystem likes to be very variable. And the median is $177,000. So half of the organizations sampled made less than spent less than $177,000 in 2018, and half spent more than $177,000 in 2018. Next slide, please. What's being reported? I promise we're going to get to the data. The values reported are the total sums for each analyzed group. So that basically means for all 708, when I show that, it's going to be, if revenue is reported, it's the revenue of all of those organizations. So every year we can kind of see that adjustment based on the total and not an average or a median or any other kind of normalized data set. Because they're the same organizations every year, we decided to just go with the summation comparison. Years reported are fiscal years. This is going to be the case with almost every data set you see. But just as a reminder, each year is represented on the graph, features some slide. So that includes data that's not necessarily from the calendar year. So this is why looking at the graphs overall for change is the important variable. So for example, in 2019, some organizations, or 2020, some organizations are reporting the full year of 2020, and other organizations are reporting half of 2019 and half of 2020. So just keeping in mind, it's more of a continuum rather than discrete years. All data reported and graphed has been adjusted for inflation. This is really important to take note of because the adjustment was about 17% from 2018 to 22. So it makes a huge difference. So all of the comparisons that I'm going to show, unless otherwise noted, are for comparable dollars and the worth and the value of the dollar. And these come from the Consumer Price Index. And again, you can reach out to me if you want more details on that. Next slide. Okay, final one, I promise, but this is the most kind of nitpicky. For statistical analyses, we use some, we got rid of outliers, positive plus or minus 3 standard deviations from the data set. This usually resulted in the exclusion of 1 to 5 outliers in the upper or lower 0.15% of each variable. So to give you an example, one of the organizations that was removed from the data set was an organization that received between $300 to $3,000 annually in contributions. And in 2022, they received $742,000 in contributions. So it's hard to say whether that's a typo or they had a wonderful, tremendous windfall that year. But either way, that data isn't likely representative of the entire population or even the sample. So we did the math and the statistics to try to make sure to identify those really extreme variations so that we could remove those from our analyses so that they wouldn't unnecessarily adjust everything. Although I would love to figure out what that company did to get that extreme difference in 2022. When comparisons were made between the 2018 figures, those are the pre-pandemic figures, and the 2022 figures, which we're calling the post-pandemic figures, each variable was evaluated using what we call a t-test, which is basically a comparison of averages, but also it takes into account the variability of each set. So it kind of says, you know, this is really extremely variable, so the difference is not likely statistically relevant. But it does all that for us through wonderful mathematical transformations that are fun for me to do, but not necessarily for everyone. And we determine statistical significance with a p-value of less than or equal to 0.05. With that final concept, a report of an NSC means no significant change. But in this case, significant refers to the statistical definition, which is very different from the standard definition that you hear on a daily basis. The statistical definition means that the results were unlikely to have occurred by random chance alone. So it's unlikely that you just had a different sample that had a different effect than what the normal population would have, suggesting that there's a real and meaningful relationship of the effect being observed. So if there's no significant change reported, it suggests that the figures have returned to pre-pandemic values. And drum roll, we're going to get to the data. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here it is. So we have a lot of stuff going on in this graph. I'm going to take a moment to describe it because most of our graphs after this are going to look similar in the way that they're presented, even though they're different groups. This graph, we have a line graph appearing on the screen showing an overall picture of changes in expenses and revenue types from 2018 to 2022. And this is our full sample of 708 nonprofit dance organizations in the United States. On the Y value, we have a sum of all organizations sampled, adjusted for inflation. That Y value goes from 0 to $1 billion. And it includes all of the monetary amounts added together for all of the organizations. We see lines representing total revenue, total expenses, contributions and grants, program service revenue, other revenue, and investment income. These are all words that are used on the 990 and can be defined very specifically. And if you are interested in those specific definitions and those line items, you can email me and I can send those to you. Or they will be included in our final report, which will come out in the end of April. We see our revenue line is the highest on this particular chart. And we see in 2018, it's above expenses. In 2019, it goes down a little bit. And then in 2020, it starts to dive, and then 2022, it hits that valley, hits the bottom, and then it starts bouncing back up in 2020. I'm sorry, I said 2022. I meant 2021. Let me start over. 2018 to 2019, a slight dip. 2019 to 2020, an increased drop. 2020 to 2021, we see that dive down to the bottom. 2021 to 2022, we see a rebound that we're hoping in 2020, 2023 that everyone has experienced last year is hopefully even higher on the rise. This is a good time to mention that a lot of times this data is a little bit behind because it is public data and it takes some time to get, and then it takes some time to clean, and it takes some time to analyze. Going to our total expenses, we see a similar drop off, but we see a much larger decline during the pandemic years. So people are spending a lot less money, which makes complete sense because there was a shutdown and production fees were no longer being made. In most cases, some cases, people still paid. And, you know, this is at any rate, I'm trying to figure out, okay, so it makes perfect sense that the expenses were dropped, and then we see them rebounding, but not up to the expenses that we saw in 2018. Looking again, because 2022 is still climbing out of that pandemic, and some people weren't quite up to the same classes that they were offering, performances that they were offering, and other programs that they were offering. We look at program service revenue. It shows the same pathway, this large drop off in 2021 and rebound. And then we look at other revenue and investment income. We're not seeing a lot of change there. Contributions and grants, actually for this large sample, shows a very slow and steady increase from 2019 to 2022. And most of that can be explained by the large amounts of government support that were infused into the organizations, predominantly organizations who had employees, because most of the government support was to retain employment. Next slide, please. So you see two rectangular boxes around the 2018 data and the 2022 data. And that is to indicate that the analyses that were completed were comparing those two data points. So it's kind of a pre and a post. And if you could go to the next slide, we'll see what those numbers look like. Sorry, Crystal. That was a quick one. Okay, on the right, you see a table, and the table matches the colors of the lines on the graph. And the total revenue for this group of people, we see no significant change. Part of that, well, I'm going to go down the table and then I'll explain that in a moment. Total expenses have dropped about 10% from 2018. Total contributions and grants are up about 27%. Program service revenue is down 32%. And there was no significant change in other revenue and investment income. It might take everyone a moment to process this, but while you're doing that, I would like to say that the no significant change in total revenue is because of a reversal in where that revenue is coming from, at least in this particular graph. And I think when SMU DataArts is able to share more data, they can actually show some of those details about how, as an ecosystem, everyone managed to kind of fill in the cracks in many different ways. But specifically in this graph, you can see that the contributed revenue and the program service revenue kind of do a reversal in terms of the amount that's coming in. And so we're looking at that possibility of why the total revenue had not changed from 2018 to 2022. And next slide, please. So we all know that sometimes different budgeted organizations operate extremely differently. So in an effort to kind of look at this analysis across different budget sizes, rather than sort of creating budget sizes and putting them onto the group that we sampled, we figured we have 708 people. Let's have the data tell us what those different sizes are. So we split them into quartiles. We have 4 groups of 25% each. I'm the numbers are there, but I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide because I'm kind of taking a little bit of time and I want to make sure that we move forward. And on this slide, it shows the equivalent budgets of 2022 so that you can kind of put yourself in this realm. So group one would be folks making the equivalent of 107 or spending the equivalent of $170 to $88,000 annually. Group two, $88,000 to $207,000. Group three, $207,000 to $507,000. And group four, $507,000 to $104 million. And I think we're having a change over here. Next slide, please. Maybe not. Okay. All right, so this is group one. The reason I'm sharing this is because each of you here, you're in this, you're doing it. And I think it feels good. I've also directed a very small organization for 25 years. It feels good to feel like you're in a group that's being shared. So you can say, that looks exactly like what's happening to us. Or you can say, that looks totally different than what's happening to us. But it kind of gives you a reference point that you can start being curious about in terms of your own data. So these folks are having a similar ramp as all of the whole data set, and we're seeing similar things. We're seeing that drop off in revenue, expenses, and program service revenue. We're seeing almost a stability in contributions and grants. It does show an 18% increase. I will say that did not meet statistical significance completely, but it is approaching at 0.09 p-value. If anyone, again, wants to talk about what that means with me, I also teach statistical analysis, so I'd love to talk to anyone who wants to learn more. I have added on this graph the net assets because one of the exciting things to see, even though this data is kind of all over the place, which is not surprising, is that every single group is showing an increase in net assets over the 5-year period. And whether it's an intentional crisis preparation, or it's an unintentional savings due to the reduction in expenses, is hard to say. But we are seeing a little bit of a strength there in terms of having some extra savings and folks having paid down some liabilities. We're seeing an overall decrease of total expenses of 8%, contributions and grants increasing 18%, program service revenue still down 21% for this group in 2022, but net assets showing a positive 22% increase. And next slide. Group two, we are covering folks who have budgets between $88,000 and $207,000. Again, I'd like to reiterate, a lot of these groups are project-oriented organizations, which probably makes up the bulk of our dance ecosystem. So a lot of the reason that these numbers may feel small to some and big to others is that there are many organizations that operate very much on a project-to-project basis. So we have our Y scale going up to 28,000 now for the total sum. We have similar drop-offs in revenue, expenses, and program service revenue in 2021, with similar rebounds occurring in 2022. Again, the hope is that it's still going up in 2023. And we see a slight increase in net assets with a significant change from 2018 of 25% over what it was. Contributions and grants, it's sort of stable, but we see a 16% statistically significant increase from 2018. So again, showing similar trends. The total revenue isn't quite back up to the 2018 revenue, but it looks like it's getting there. And I don't want to go too quickly because I want everyone in each group to get a moment, but we should go to the next slide. And there will be a report at the end of April, and this is recorded. So group three, 207,000 to 507,000, again, showing the similar trend, revenue, expenses, and program service revenue, doing the downward dip and the bounce back up, hopefully continuing to 2023. We see our net assets increasing gradually. We see in this group contributions and grants starting to show an even more clear visual increase on the graph. Again, this is likely because this is the range of budgetary size where folks are probably starting to see employment numbers over 1. The other groups are likely, if they have employees, it's typically one person who's employed for multiple tasks and then contracted out for different kinds of projects. In this group, we see no significant change in total revenue, a drop in total expenses of 7%, a 36% increase in contributions and grants, a drop in 24% program service revenue, and an increase of 37% in net assets. Next slide, please. This is our last and final group for this particular comparison. Typically, this is the group you would most likely see in most data reports that are voluntary. A lot of times for people to be able to voluntarily provide this information typically means that they have a staff member and they have capacity to capture and record and then share this information. So this group is between 507,000 and 104 million. Again, I should reiterate that we did run some outliers before we ran the analyses, so it may not have included everyone in this group. We see the biggest difference in this one that we see is that net assets has always been a little bit higher than everything else. And part of that is because the savings is much more, it's much larger relative to their revenue and expenses. We do see the same drop in revenue and expenses and the same drop in program service revenue that we saw in both other groups. We see the same rebound. And we do see an increase again in contributions and grants in the lines. Let's go ahead and look at the numbers. So total revenue shows no significant change. Total expenses is down 10%. Contributions and grants is up 33%. Program service revenue down 21%. And net assets up 28%. And next slide, please. This is sort of an interesting comparison. What I did is we just compared 2018 to 2022 without all the middle stuff. In the left-hand chart, you see a comparison if someone just popped up the numbers without adjusting for inflation. So you see everything going up in terms of the cash value, except for the contributions and grants and program service revenue, which have an exact reversal pretty much. So maybe not exact, sorry, a reversal. So that reversal is probably what contributes to some of those revenues not being significantly different from 2018 and 2022. It is really interesting to note that in the second graph on the right, you see a little bit of a drop in areas where you saw an increase, particularly the revenue and the expenses. And that is because of inflation. So inflation is really kind of where we are right now. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I think SMU DataArts has a little bit more granular data here, so that's exciting. Government contributions, we do not have data for groups 1 or 2 because they are not required to report this as a separate line item in their 990 EZ. For group 3, we see 167% increase in government contributions, which is equates to a $5.7 million increase. That is comparing for the same dollar value for each year. In group 4, we see a 346% increase, and that equates to a total sum dollar value of $90.6 million. Non-government contributions, again, same things for groups 1 and 2. We don't have that information, but I think SMU DataArts will be able to share some of that. So that's exciting. We don't see a significant change in groups 3 and 4, but I did go ahead and report the dollars because they are negative. The reason we might not be seeing a significant change statistically is because it might be so variable that it's hard to capture whether or not this is a change that's occurring to the entire population or just to some particular individual organizations within this sample. Investment income is required it's a line item on all of the 990s, but we didn't have enough people or organizations who have investment income to have any. We had insufficient data for analyses, except for in the last group, we had 60 out of 176. Although as a data analyst and researcher, I sometimes find this information just as interesting as the variables that are being looked at. And 60, we went ahead and compared that. There was no significant change in investment income between 2018 and 2022. Next slide. Last one, again, this is a little bit informational, very broad. SMU DataArts is going to have some more information here. But for group 1, we see no significant change in program service expenses. Group 2, we see a drop of 15% in program service expenses. Group 3, we see a drop of 9%. Group 4 has the biggest drop of 47%, likely because many of their productions are much more expensive. And so that drop in not bringing back those productions is a lot more, is a lot larger. Administrative expenses, we don't have the data for groups 1 and 2, and we don't see a significant change in group 3. There's my timer, and we see a 17% drop in group 4. And I believe that is the last slide. Crystal, let me know if I made it just under the time. I did, thank you. And we are going to be taking questions. I'm sure Crystal's been taking all the rolling questions this whole time that I haven't been able to see, but I'm hoping to be able to answer many or all of those. And I also do hope that while you're here, you can help us provide some context to this data, because you're the ones out there doing the work, feeling these changes, and figuring out ways to balance these things. So without any further ado, I would like to switch to Zannie Voss from SMU DataArts, who is going to be able to take us a little bit deeper in some of those numbers that the 990s just don't cover. Thanks so much.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. Let's see. Want to make sure we're all good here? Okay. That was really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you to Sarah, to Crystal, to all the team at Dance USA for organizing, for hosting the session. I'm Zannie Voss. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of SMU DataArts and a professor at SMU. And I want to first acknowledge the Indigenous peoples, past and present, whose ancestral and unceded territory we occupy at SMU DataArts. We specifically honor the Apache, the Caddo, the Comanche, the Coushatta, the Tonkawa, Wichita-affiliated Kichi, the Waco, Tawakoni, and the Lenni Lenape peoples, upon whose traditional territories we now operate. I am a multiracial woman, and I have light brown skin, dark brown hair and eyes. Today I'm wearing a white sleeveless top and a necklace that's both green and black. I'm in a white room with pink and yellow, a pink and yellow painting behind me. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with SMU DataArts, we're a National Center for Arts Research that exists to provide and to engage both organizations and individuals with the evidence-based insights needed to collectively build strong, vibrant, and equitable arts communities. And thinking about strong and equitable arts communities, I want to just start with a quick reflection on, has your organization moved on from the pandemic entirely? In living through this experience, are things better off now than they were before? Or are you still feeling many of the lingering effects? And if so, how? Where is that appearing? And for many arts and cultural organizations, there's no going back to the way things were before the pandemic started. And so the questions then are, what do the past few years help us to understand about the context for the present? And how will we go forward in new and stable ways? So I'm going to share some highlights about trends in the finances and operations and a bit of a more granular dive. We don't have the market cornered on arts research or good ideas, so I've infused this presentation with research of some colleagues whom I'm going to recognize. So we analyzed trend data on the same set of 129 nonprofit dance organizations from 2019 through 2022. They're in 12 states with budgets ranging from $9,500 to $33 million in 2022. Their average budget size was 1.4 million, and their median, or kind of the midpoint, smack in the middle, dividing the set in two, the midpoint in the range was a budget of 260,000. So you can see there's some skewing going on at the upper end. All our organizations that submitted this data to a funder through the cultural data profile. So a huge thank you to all organizations whose time and whose effort was invested in the CDP, and it allows us to share these findings with you today. This is your story. I'm going to report on findings overall, and you'll hear me slicing and dicing it by two different lenses, by budget size, and then again by mission focus. When I refer to budget size, here you have the pie chart of what is the distribution of sizes of the 129. We're going to consider small, under 100,000, medium, 100 to basically 500,000, and then over 500,000. So these are really similar to Sarah's sample in terms of distribution of organizations by size. In terms of mission focus, within these organizations, 29% self-identify as being of, by, or for Black, Indigenous, or people of color communities or traditions. 71% do not. So there are too few organizations rooted in a particular cultural single heritage or tradition to report out on them separately. So you're going to hear me refer collectively to non-BIPOC and BIPOC organizations at times, acknowledging that the term is imperfect and imprecise. I do want to start by pointing out here you have average budget size for both of these two cohorts. In 2022, the average non-BIPOC's budget was 2.5 times that of a BIPOC organization. Back in 2019, it was 3 times the size. So it tells us two things. That gap has narrowed slightly, which is good news, but overall, they had neither the same average starting place nor the same ending place. So any notion of this really leveling a playing field is still not reality. And I also want to consider that equity is not just in percentage changes, but in magnitude of the values that are changing. So, if you go from $100 to $200 for a line item, that's a doubling of that value, but it's still only $100. So take that into account. Like Sarah, we look at inflation. What cost $1 at the end of 2019 cost $1.15 at the end of 2022. And so the charts that I show are going to reflect the raw dollars pre-inflation, but the percentages are going to tell the story of whether or not those dollars have the same buying power over time. So let's dive in with expenses. Expenses, good news is, spiked, grew from 2021 to 2022. As organizations reopened their doors, reinstituted in-person programming, expenses were 2% higher in raw dollars, but buying power was 11% lower. So 11% growth falling short of inflation. There are tangible goods and services that cost more. There's fabric, there's shipping. The growth in general and administrative costs exceeded inflation by 1%. Driving that were things like interest expense. Interest expense was 40% higher as interest rates rose in the marketplace and organizations had to pay mortgages, tap lines of credit. Fundraising expenses were 25% lower and program expenses 14% lower, again, as doors were reopening. When we look at who grew, interestingly, BIPOC organizations grew their budgets 14% above inflation, while non-BIPOC organizations cut their total expenses by 15%. And this isn't due to size. The growth in BIPOC organizations' budgets wasn't a phenomenon felt by all small and medium budget organizations. For both budget categories overall, expense growth lagged inflation by 6%, and that for large organizations was 13%. So this is really not something that's just due to size. And so let's take a look at the biggest budget item, which is paying people. Regardless of budget size, compensation counts for about 60% of all expenses for the average dance organization. And here we find that on average, permanent staff became larger, mainly through the addition of part-time positions. They began adding permanent staff in 2022. Once the doors reopened, they went from an average of 17 permanent positions, full and part-time in 2019, to an average of 24 in 2022. The mix of workers shifted. You see that in the chart, with part-time workers accounting for 6% more of the permanent workforce over time. This pattern was the same for medium and large organizations to different degrees. Small organizations, though, had a different reality. They averaged 0 full-time permanent positions and 1 part-time permanent position every year. So consider that with respect to organizational capacity constraints. What we know is as organizations increase in size, they tend to make the shift from majority part-time staff to having as many full-time staff as part-time staff. So that's the story for permanent staff. And yet we know there's a lot of hiring that happens on a temporary basis. So let's take a look. we find that cuts were made to seasonal staff. The average 2 full-time seasonal workers went to 1 in 2020 and remained there. The 11-member part-time seasonal workforce was reduced to 5 by 2021, went back up to 9 in 2022 for an overall 11% reduction. Not shown in the chart is independent contractors. The hiring dipped, but basically in 2022, it was exactly back to where it started in 2019. As part of the total numbers, small and large organizations, small and large, hired fewer artists over time, whereas medium budget organizations actually hired 11% more artists over time. Let's add in personnel expenses. So although staffs in total were like 13% larger, personnel expense was up 9% in raw dollars, but growth fell 5% behind inflation, despite a 45% jump in 2022 after 2 years of consecutive contractions. So more people, but less compensation flowed to them in real inflation-adjusted dollars. Part of that's due to the fact that there's more presence of part-timers now than full-timers. But it's important to recognize that inflation isn't just an organizational phenomenon. Those employed feel the effects of inflation in their own personal lives. So this is an area of a bit of a cause of concern. Breaking it down a bit further, if we look at different programmatic areas, so 90% of people paid are related to program delivery, and their compensation fell short of inflation 4%. Included in that line are artists whose pay actually rose 5% above inflation, meaning that other program-related personnel were disproportionately affected. General administrative personnel expense growth exceeded inflation by 12%. Fundraisers was 24% below inflation. Now, growth in personnel expenses is inversely related to budget size. So large organizations' payment to people fell 7% short of inflation, medium organizations 3%, but for small organizations, and remember they had 0 full-time permanent and 1 part-time permanent position, small organizations actually had growth in personnel expenses that topped inflation by 7%. We know what a big subject this is. The ability to attract and to retain employees has really become quite a flashpoint for the arts. It puts added strain on people who are often overburdened, who are likely burned out after having weathered the stress and managing through recent crises. In 2022, averaging across all nonprofit arts and cultural disciplines, including employees and freelance artists, in another study, we found that the average annual salary in the United States was $33,024. So a little bit above the poverty level for a family of 4, but not by much. This is an issue. A bright spot, again, were BIPOC organizations. Recall that I mentioned they had expense growth that exceeded inflation by 14%. Well, a majority of that came in the way of investments in people. Their personnel growth outpaced inflation by 16%, whereas non-BIPOC organizations' personnel expense growth actually fell short of inflation by 9%. Let's take a look at revenue. We're going to look at the magnitude and the composition kind of at a 30,000-foot view right here of unrestricted operating revenue. And we found that there was nominal or kind of raw growth in total operating revenue, but its buying power was 9% lower and its composition shifted. The composition of where the money came from shifted. The dance organizations became and remain more dependent on contributed revenue for survival. It's the revenue engine. The trends that you see here were similar regardless of organization size. So typically the percentage of total revenue that's contributed tends to decrease with organizational size. And the organizations in this study are no different in that respect. Small and medium budget organizations went from about 56% contributed to 66% contributed in 2022. And let's unpack it and look more closely at the sources of revenue and how they've changed. I'm going to start with earned revenue. Earned revenue did rebound robustly in 2022 over 2021, but it still has a long road ahead to get to recovery. In the last slide, we saw that it was lower as a proportion of total revenue. It was also lower in absolute terms for organizations of every size. There's good news in that it more than doubled, but it was still 30% lower over time in inflation-adjusted figures for the average organization in the study. I don't want to rain on the recovery parade, but this represents a huge hole to fill. And everyone's hurting in this area, but to varying degrees and in different ways. Total earned revenue was down by a third for non-BIPOC organizations and by a quarter for BIPOC organizations. And I want to unpack and drill down on earned revenue a bit further. Since ticket and membership admissions revenue, it's an important part of total earned revenue for the average organization in normal times. Let's start there. The finding: attendance, ticket revenue, and low prices were lower by double digits. In-person attendance was down 38%. Admissions generated revenue overall naturally slowed to a trickle during the pandemic. It rebounded in 2022, but it was still 32% lower than it was pre-pandemic in real dollars. And I want to look at it through the two lenses. When we look by budget, double-digit reductions in single ticket revenue was the case for organizations on average across all sizes, with the losses increasing as budget size went down. So a loss in single ticket revenue of 22% for large organizations, going up to 51% for small organizations. Total participation in in-person programs was down 40% for non-BIPOC companies, 31% for BIPOC companies. And given that, we're kind of put a couple of pieces together here. Given that attendance is down more than single ticket revenue, we can infer that there's a bit more volume being sold towards the high end of the single ticket prices than at the low end. It's driven by large organizations. Their drop in attendance was actually 42% over the 5-year period, but their drop in ticket revenue was only 22%. And you're saying, so this is all fine. You're showing us 2022, didn't things turn around in 2023? Our partners at TRG Arts, whose data tends to skew more to kind of medium and large performing arts organizations, they recently released an update on the recovery status of ticket sales and ticket revenue through December of 2023, so just a couple of months ago. And compared to 2019, organizations that they study sold 11% fewer tickets in 2023, still at the end of the year, but saw ticket revenue go up 5%. The question mark now is, how long will attendance plateau? Or is this going to be a continued slow rebuild, a slow burn? It remains to be seen. And of course, COVID was a major factor in the attendance drop-off, but in a lot of ways, it actually intensified declining trends that existed pre-pandemic. The NEA's 2017 survey of public participation in the arts reported 15-year declines in the percentage of U.S. adults who attend ballet and other dance. This was topped in the 2022 report release that showed attendance dropping even further since 2017. And I want to just point out this subscription revenue down 67%, number of subscribers down 51%. This is an area that appears to be permanently scarred, not just for dance, but across performing arts sectors. I can share that in theater, over the past 20 years, theater subscription sales nationally were at their highest point in 2005. It's been a slow and steady decline ever since then. So enough about ticket sales. Let's see, how else did these organizations earn revenue? They did it from diverse activities. Here you're looking at 2022 figures for small, medium, and large organizations. What we see is that revenue earned from education programs, the blue slice, it was a bigger slice of the earned revenue pie than ticket sales, the rose and orange slices there, for small and medium organizations. And the reverse was true for large organizations. Education revenue was down 38% considering inflation across the board, regardless of organization type by the end of 2022. Revenue from contracts and tours, the yellow slice, plays an increasingly important role as budget size decreased. And this is really kind of interesting. The BIPOC and non-BIPOC organizations had nearly identical average revenue from tours and contracts in 2019, the same starting place. Two different trajectories. The BIPOC organizations grew their tour and contract revenue by 12%, whereas the revenue from this activity was down by more than half for non-BIPOC organizations. Let's turn to contributed revenue. Contributed revenue raised for operations. This really saved organizations. Growth exceeded inflation by 11%. So that's 27% growth without inflation, and it was almost eerily consistent for organizations of every size. Impressively, BIPOC organizations' contributed revenue growth exceeded inflation by 38%, whereas that of non-BIPOC Organizations did so by only 7%. The question is, for all, is that level of growth really sustainable? And to answer that question, we need to dig deeper to see where the revenue came from. So let's look at trends to see if there's a story of consistent growth from some revenue engines that can be expected to continue out into the future. I'm going to start with private philanthropy. Did it come from private philanthropy? And what we see is no. Private philanthropy for the nonprofit dance organization studied was lower in raw dollars and 27% lower considering inflation. It peaked in 2021 at the height of the pandemic, then plummeted from 21 to 22. So was the downward trend across all private giving sources? Let's lift up the hood and look. Among the major private sources, none provided funding that kept pace with inflation. I'm going to show figures for both unrestricted and restricted giving, sort of the entire outpouring of commitment from these different funding sources. And I encourage you to reflect and share whether the trends that I show you today really resonate with your organization. So here's the story. Corporate and kind of non-trustee, we would call other individual support, we're at a 4-year low in 2022, even before adjusting for inflation. That's particularly important regarding other individual support, since that was a category that constituted 40% of private support in 2019 and only 30% in 2022. Both individual and trustee support peaked in 2020 at the start of the pandemic, and then you see a little bit of fatigue setting in. The average medium, small, and large budget organization all experienced double-digit decreases in giving from other individuals. So it's not a size issue. And corporate giving just about disappeared for small and medium dance organizations in this study. It was down by 80%. So here we show the real inflation-adjusted percentage decreases by source. And I know it's really sobering. Is it donor fatigue, or are we seeing a generational shift in donor preferences? According to 2023, this is a survey from CCS Fundraising. While arts and culture is second on a list of baby boomers' giving priorities, it doesn't even make it to the top 3 for Gen Xers, Millennials, and Gen Z. They say that there's a distinct lack of engagement and also simply a lack of awareness of the arts and cultural landscape, both from new money, particularly in the tech industry, and from younger generations whose parents supported the arts. If we look at trustee giving, we see that trustee giving, it grew in nominal terms, but it was 9% lower in real dollars. And I want to focus now for a second on foundation giving. Foundations now play a bigger role in supporting these dance organizations than do individuals. It's a reversal. 35% of private support was from foundations in 2019, going up to 45% in 2022. Foundation support peaked in 2021. It rose in raw dollars over the period, but its impact was muted by cost pressures, so it fell 6% below inflation. However, this real dollar loss in foundation giving, it was not the experience of organizations of every size or of every mission focus. The trend actually belies the experience of the average small and medium budget organization, whose support from foundations rose more than 50% back in 2020 and then remained that high over subsequent years. Foundation growth for BIPOC organizations specifically was 27% higher. So foundations have been their private philanthropy revenue engine. Large organizations support, on the other hand, was higher over time in nominal terms, fell short of inflation. And what we're seeing here for large organizations is kind of stagnant foundation funding. So what was the big revenue engine for growth? As Sarah alluded to, it's exceptional government funding. It drove the rise in contributed revenue. It supported an increasing level of the average organization's expenses over the past 4 years, going up from covering 5% of expenses to 23% of expenses in 2022. Everyone made out well, but to varying degrees and in different ways. So small and medium organizations' government support growth surpassed inflation by 67% and 87% respectively. And that sounds really good, right? Well, large organizations saw 5-fold growth in government funding. So viewed through a different lens, the non-BIPOC organizations were much bigger winners in terms of government funding. Again, on average, 5-fold increase. For BIPOC organizations, it was a 2-fold increase. And there are further nuances with respect to organization size. Small organizations tend to cover more of their expenses with government funding. They have a greater tendency to serve organizations without great wealth. They saw only a minor boost directly from federal funding, but they saw higher average funding in 2022 from state agencies in terms of regranting. Large dance organizations were the biggest beneficiaries of exceptional federal support from PPP program, the shuttered venue operating grants. They also gained state support. So for them, it went from 4% of their expenses to 2019 to 22% in 2022. Federal programs kept a lot of organizations afloat during the pandemic, saved jobs in the arts, fulfilling their intended purpose. Those dollars were one time and are not likely to continue. So once this trickle down of federal funding makes its way through lower levels of government through regranting programs, what's going to be that future revenue engine to sustain recovery? Are we seeing any evidence of that on a consistent basis for this set of organizations? Think about what we've seen. Is there really a revenue source poised to grow support at a pace that keeps up with rising costs, which are rising at a much slower rate now, but they're still rising? Large organizations in particular are vulnerable since their biggest and only contributed revenue growth came from government funding. It was exceptional, again, but unlikely to continue. Referring again to our partners at TRG Arts, they report that through December of 2023, there were 5% fewer individual gifts made to performing arts organizations, and gift revenue was 31% lower. So smaller gifts being made by fewer people. Recovery in individual gifts began stalling back in the summer and didn't see the boost in the fall and the year-end surge that they've seen in years past. Companies are likely to scale back if private contributions, ticket revenue, and education program sales remain this repressed. Good news, again, inflation has cooled substantially. It remains to be seen what's going to happen in 2024. So let's put two and two together quickly and look at bottom line. I put these two side by side because I think it's really important to see that organizations did a remarkable job of living within their means during the crisis. Big fluctuations in activity were met with the ability to be nimble and to be flexible and to live within means. You see average surpluses every year. There's good news in that fewer dance organizations ended 2022 with a deficit than did in 2019. And annually, the majority ended the year in the black. When we dig deeper, though, we see a little bit of difference. We find that 11% more small organizations ran a deficit over time in the field, whereas for medium organizations, it was about the same proportion running deficits. For 18% fewer, far fewer large organizations ran a deficit at the end of the period compared to the beginning. So it's really kind of clear that the large organizations benefited more than the small ones from substantial enough levels of support to keep them afloat. And when I think about 2023, we've looked at 2023 trend data for about 250 organizations on a variety of disciplines across the country. And when it comes to deficits, we're seeing deficits start to seep back in as organizations are dealing with expenses fully coming back to pre-pandemic levels, if not exceeding it, while operating growth isn't keeping pace. The duration of the government relief funding hasn't quite matched that slower rebuild and return experienced by most organizations who are still in the process of recovering. I'm going to look quickly at working capital, lastly. Think about, has your organization ever been cash strapped? And what did that feel like? If your organization's ever been cash strapped, you probably know more about working capital than you would like to know. It's not the kind of thing that people, wake up with excitement over, but it is the kind of thing that when it's not there, you lose sleep over it. So it's a measure of liquidity that represents unrestricted resources available to meet day-to-day obligations. It's readily accessible cash. There are different ways to calculate it. We use unrestricted current assets less current liabilities. And a metric that's kind of handy is months of working capital. It shows how long an organization could survive at its current expense size in the absence of revenues. And as one organization who had interviewed earlier this year for a project stated, liquidity like cash flow, it sounds simplistic, but it lets you dream big and really think ahead about strategic growth, which you can't do if you can't turn the lights on. It relieves the not sleeping at night issue, lets you get beyond basic needs. It's where resiliency begins. So this really unsexy topic really has some profound implications. What's the trend? With government funding pouring in, doors closed, unrestricted current assets grew 85% and current liabilities shrank by 35%. So that's that big growth in net assets that Sarah was referring to. Small and medium organizations in particular benefited from a surge in foundation funding, huge boost to working capital. Recall that operating surpluses were the norm from 2020 to 2022 for all organizations. And here we're seeing the substantial cushion that organizations are currently feeling in terms of liquidity. Again, the question is, this is great, but is it the new reality? Is this new level of liquidity realistically sustainable? Or are we going to see in 2023 and 24 an erosion in working capital as savings are used to plug holes in revenue projections that don't materialize from a really strong revenue engine? So how are organizations creating a plan B and growing? And I'm going to end here with some recommendations for stabilizing and restoring health. For funders, this is work that we had done in collaboration with Rebecca Thomas of Rebecca Thomas and Associates. Support flexibility and reimagining in rebuilding. We encourage fund to support strategies for new business models and adaptation that help organizations shift dynamics. Encourage creation of a plan B that doesn't count on a once-in-a-lifetime level of government support. Invest in capacity building that addresses human capital gaps. Think of this as unrestricted multi-year capacity building funds for salaries and for staff positions so organizations can really earnestly address gaps in adequately paid human capital, particularly in the areas of fundraising and marketing, before encouraging growth in programs. Some research we did with the Wallace Foundation, it was really clear that small organizations don't all want to remain small, but they lack dedicated staff expertise in generating earned and contributed revenue. And they've historically faced barriers to accessing higher levels of funding, which frequently are focused on developing new programs without increasing staff. Reinforce new business models. As organizations enter 2024 with demand for in-person programming still down, they're going to need a mix of flexible support. Signal trust by making the unrestricted gifts and for longer periods of time. And contribute to working capital and to savings. For the organizations, know your financial risks, assess and project cash levels and flows. Can you afford a deficit this year? If one materializes, how are you going to deal with it? Are you doing monthly forecasts of predicted and actual cash receipts versus expenditures for the next year? Explore a few different alternative pathways. Develop at least 2 scenarios for a surplus. Plan to redo your plans. If we've not learned anything over the past 2 years, it's that the environment can quickly change. And are you prepared for it? This uncertainty is a given. Monitor results regularly and be prepared to implement a plan B if necessary. And then start setting a savings goal. Be realistic, be patient. Assemble your board to discuss realistic goals. If you want to eventually save for 3 months of working capital, budget for a surplus equal to 1 month of expenses in each of the coming years. Here are a number of different areas where we do research in DataArts, financial and operating health, BIPOC organizations and equity. Audiences, we look at demand prediction and DEI, and we apply research in communities on a broad scale. I encourage you to go to our website and check out some of these resources. The story for 2024 remains unwritten. Time is going to tell whether resiliency exhibited by dance organizations in the wake of the previous crises are going to prevail, and whether this is going to prove to be a crisis like no other. I think it really hinges on embracing and adopting new models, building and bolstering relationships within the community with artists, and rethinking how to understand and meet needs of the folks whom we serve. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to encourage Sarah to join me and hear what resonated for you, whether you found some findings surprising or counterintuitive, and answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Zannie. I think Crystal's going to moderate the questions coming in so we can have a bit of a discussion. I'm excited about what people have to ask or say. Or Crystal, you want to
Yes, let me look through. So first question came in from two different people. So I will ask, and this was specifically, Sarah, when you were presenting, does this study capture organizations that may not have continued to file because they went out of business during COVID? And then someone asked in a similar way, let me just find it. Oh, did stats from organizations that closed permanently between 2018 and 2022 get factored in?
First of all, I love those questions. And the challenge with most arts research is that it's retrospective research. So it's always sort of done after the fact. Ideal research would be prospective. So you could get like, say, 200 organizations to agree to fill out surveys for the next 10 years. And then you can kind of track them and see who falls out and why. Those are great questions. Government data, IRS data, unfortunately, to close an organization, it can sometimes take up to 3 or 4 years through forms and registration and acknowledgement. So there's really no way to tell from government data when someone has officially closed. If it's not in the IRS form year for that year, you can assume several things. One, they just didn't get it in on time and they're going to get it in late. Two, they've gone out of business and they're filing for closure. Three, they've gone out of business and they're not filing for closure. But typically those kinds of things only come in 3 or 4 years after the fact. And that's usually only if the government is really paying close attention to track that information. So the short answer is that no, we are not able to actually track through this data organizations who were shuttered and closed down. And it's a really important factor to bring up because we're including organizations that filed all 5 years, we're already skewing our sample to organizations that are healthy in the eyes of like the large picture. I would love to sometime get funding to do a prospective study and be able to compensate organizations or just dance ensembles, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit LLCs, to follow them over a 10-year period of time or longer. There have been lots of studies in the behavior sciences that have done this, usually funded by large organizations like the NIH. But wouldn't it be great if we could get some arts funding to provide some compensation for this kind of information so that the folks spending so much time having hybrid careers and trying to run a dance company could also give us some information that could tell us more about their life and their survival.
Thank
You're
you.
here.
Did
And
I
I'll
answer? There were 2 questions. Did I answer them both?
Yeah, they were very similar. I just wanted
Okay.
to say them because they were asked in 2 different ways. So this
Great
is
question.
to Zannie or Sarah. Do you think that one-time relief funding played a role in the rebound in total revenues? A lot of that came in during 2021 and 2022. And so this person wonders if we will see a dip in 2023 because of the type of revenue that makes it appear that there was a rebound.
Yes, absolutely. In the answer to the question, the federal relief, as I had shown, was kind of the saving grace. It was the revenue engine during those years. From what we've seen from the 2023 data for organizations, we've got about 250 organizations across a wide variety of arts and cultural disciplines, is that the federal relief has come way down in 2023, but what we see is the increase in local and state funding. And it's because a lot of the federal funding, I see Sunil's on the call today, went out for redistribution through local agencies and through state agencies. There were also other federal initiatives, some of which came to our local arts agencies without necessarily being set up for arts and culture. So from a city, they decided to allocate some. That's where we're seeing the growth in 2023. Ultimately, that's likely to dry up as well.
To contribute to that, because there was that reversal of service related revenue, and contributor revenue. The additional hope, and what we're seeing in a much smaller sample, is that service-related revenue is continuing to climb back. Now, whether or not it's going to be able to readjust, I mean, the hope is that this was a plug and a sort of a temporary stop hold. But I think we're seeing that that's going to play out, not the understanding of that is going to play out through 2023 and 2024 and onward. What I'd really love to see, Zannie, I don't even know if it's available. I'd love to see like 10 years of data to see what the variability looks like in normal years. And to see if some of the challenges we're dealing with are the challenges of our industry and or the challenges of our industry within this time period and or the challenges of the time period. And trying to disentangle those things is really complicated with retrospective data and also not having the same data for large groups of people over a long period of time.
Well, and Sarah, too, your point about, being able to do prospective study, I say here because I think part of the difficulty, we can look back 20 years, but it becomes way skewed towards large organizations that have the capacity on an annual basis to provide that kind of data. So we can report out, but it's really not the truth for the field writ large. It's the truth for a set of larger organizations.
Yeah, exactly. And the larger organizations that have continued.
Yeah, that have continued. I will say that we're doing some, we'll publish within the next couple of weeks a report where we did 11 case studies of redistribution of federal funding by local arts agencies of COVID funding. And for some of them, it's really inspirational in that they have gained momentum within their city councils, within their communities, with the hope that the elevated levels of support will have some positive impact on future levels of appropriation.
Thank you both. And for this portion of the Q&A, I'll just ask that anyone who has an additional question, just use the raise hand function in the bottom in your menu bar, and then I will take you off mute to ask your question. So we've got one that has come in.
So I thought our company, I'm with the Louisville Ballet, we instituted a ballet bound program during the pandemic, and we're trying to raise money to sustain it going forward. And we were interested in knowing whether or not you were beginning to track BIPOC programs within non-BIPOC organizations.
I can speak for SMU DataArts. That's not data that we collect. So I don't have programmatic level data with respect to those kinds of decisions. I have things like number of programmatic offerings, and we do ask organizations 2 different questions on the survey itself, but it's more at the organization level about whether their mission is rooted in a particular cultural voice or tradition, and a separate question asking if they primarily serve a particular demographic, but we don't have one saying, are you doing any programming kind of with that rubric, and collecting separate data on that programmatic activity relative to other activity.
Okay, and the other comment I was going to make is we did a peer group study using data from Dance USA and calibrating it between 1/2 to 2 times our budget. And and that would all fall into what you've discussed throughout this program as large companies. And within that group, the earned revenue was 60% and the contributed revenue was 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I guess what I'm thinking is, in order to be sustainable over the long term, organizations need to be focused on earned revenue, because that's how you rebuild your donor base, through strong schools, through strong programming that people want to attend, and that's where we're placing our emphasis.
And just to share that across performing arts disciplines, it's the norm for organizations to be more reliant on earned revenue the larger they become. Part of that's tied to the ability to bring in more people, but part of it is tied to higher ticket prices.
Hello. I had a question. I think this pertains to Sarah's presentation. Did you find a difference in ballet company data compared to modern dance companies, tap dance companies? Is that data available?
Again, I love your question because I was very interested in that myself. I was able to do a comparison on the NPEE codes. However, when I looked at the codes, they're not really used very well. So the data was not really representative of reality. For example, a lot of ballet companies coded themselves as A62, which is dance non-ballet, and a lot of even dance organizations who are performing organizations code themselves as performing arts organizations. So it's a different code altogether. So while this data set is very large and it does encompass hopefully even those outside of this coding, I was not able to actually do that comparison with any kind of meaningful outcome. But I will say that when I did the comparison, it didn't show much of a difference across the variables. And that allowed me to look a little closer because I do know that they operate extremely differently. I know ballet, especially the larger ballet companies, tend to be home-based. And so they have home-based presentations, and smaller organizations tend to tour a little bit more, including smaller ballet organizations. But the short answer is no, I could not look at that difference. But I did attempt to, because the data appeared to be there, but it was not really a valid comparison. So again, a prospective study would allow us to look at that much more accurately.
Definitely. Thank you. And for Zannie, just a clarifying question. We saw a increase or decrease in the attendance to live dance performances,
Yeah.
but the revenue drop was less than the drop we saw in attendance. Was that due to increased prices of tickets, or what was reasoning for that?
It's a question of how many tickets were sold at which price points. So we saw that on average, both the low and the high ticket prices were actually lowered by the dance organizations in this study. But because the revenue the revenue drop was less than the attendance drop, we can assume that there's probably more volume sold at the higher prices.
Zannie, I actually have some interesting sort of informal, not completed data on that.
Great.
In a small sample of what I was looking at for 2023, it appeared as though people were giving far fewer complimentary tickets than they had in the past. So audience capacity was disproportionately representative of the revenue. And I don't know why. I haven't been able to ask organizations this question, but my personal assumption would be that perhaps because people were still concerned about spacing and, social distancing, maybe they weren't giving away as many of the complimentary tickets as had been done in the past. But again, this is all very theoretical, and that's why we're here though, right? Is to discuss these possibilities.
All right, and one more question.
Cora has her.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for all of the information. And you said it might feel tedious in the beginning, but it felt really great. It was just for me. So thank you. I'm kind of wondering about sort of the lack of investment of corporations, and if you guys have any further information around that, like why that is. And then if you can just answer that, that's great. But then my other question is, did you see any move in sort of organizations switching from earned revenue, like not relying so much on ticket sales, but finding other ways to create earned revenue? Thank you.
I'm going to answer the second question first, and that's just to say we are seeing greater revenue diversity, earned revenue diversity. As I said, for the BIPOC organizations in the study, the tour and contract revenue growth was really quite impressive. Coming out of the pandemic, it's not that the numbers are necessarily going up because there was less revenue earned overall, yet proportionally, there was more of a diversified portfolio emerging. And I think that's really important seeds to plant for future health. As I said, there was more education revenue earned than ticket revenue earned by small and medium organizations, which kind of came as a surprise to me, perhaps not at all as a surprise to you. With respect to corporate giving, that's been on the decline for arts and culture for quite some time. It was one of the areas that, coming out of the Great Recession, it was on the decline and then took a precipitous fall. It was permanently scarred and hasn't come back. The pandemic was another kind of inflection point where it took yet another dive. It fell off for organizations of every ilk, most for small and medium organizations and a bit less for large organizations. As to the why, I think there's a lot of different competition for corporate attention, particularly during social crises, of why aren't they supporting those who are homeless or poverty, or the ways that people throughout the country are being immediately affected. It'll be interesting to see in the future whether that's something that can open up a bit of discussion amongst corporate leaders.
Lovely. Sarah, quickly, anything on that before we end?
I know we're at time, so again, I just invite anyone to reach out if they have questions or want to have more conversations, just with a little patience because I will be out of town. But my email door is always open, and I'm always willing to discuss dance data.
Thank you so much, Zannie and Sarah, for sharing this data with us. And I encourage everyone on this call to stay connected to Dance USA. Again, this recording will be made available for playback. I know a lot of you had questions about whether the slides would be available, so we'll get you that answer as well. In the meantime, I hope that you are doing well and stay connected to Dance USA. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.